their reflections fractured in the smudged surface. Troy Mathers, the ringleader with a grin sharpened by arrogance, whispered something to Mason and Connor. They chuckled, the sound muffled but unmistakable. The words still carried. She won't last a week. The bet had been made, and Lila knew it wasn't about mechanics. It was about her place in a world that didn't expect her to belong here at all. The wrench slipped from her grasp, clattering against the concrete floor. The laughter sharpened like glass. Mr. Hawkins, their instructor, barely looked up from his clipboard, only shaking his head as if to confirm what he'd already decided. She was a novelty act at best, a distraction at worst. The boys filed in, tossing their bags down, the smell of cologne clashing with the mechanical tang of the room. That morning, Hawkins outlined the semester's project. Each student would design and build a functioning small-scale engine to be tested at the end of term. Marks would be based not only on performance, but on innovation. "If you're here to play safe, you're in the wrong class," he said, his eyes sweeping past Lila as though she were invisible. The first spark of defiance flared in her chest. She had grown up around the guttural coughs of tractors and the patient huff of horses in their stalls. Her father's horse ranch, once the pride of the valley, was now a skeletal version of itself, half the stables empty, the roof sagging in places. Her mother had died when she was 9, leaving behind a hollow space in their home and a quiet ache in her father's voice. But the barn still carried traces of her. Old tools hung with meticulous care, yellowed diagrams tucked between feed sacks, and a faint scent of lavender in the loft that the years hadn't managed to erase. After class, Lila cycled home, the late autumn air sharp against her cheeks. The ranch came into view, its faded red barn leaning slightly, as if tired of holding itself upright. Inside, the warm musk of hay mixed with the cold tang of engine parts she'd salvaged over the years. There, in a far corner under a stack of horse blankets, she found her mother's old notebook. The leather cover was worn soft from years of handling, the edges curling like dried leaves. Inside were sketches of engine designs unlike anything she'd ever seen. Pistons shaped in strange arcs, gear alignments that mimicked something alive. One page in particular was marked with a faded star. She ran her finger over the diagram. It was labeled Biological Motion Integration, Equine Model. The notes were brief, but the implication was staggering. Her mother had been experimenting with ways to make engines move more like living creatures, harnessing the efficiency of muscle and bone. Lila's mind buzzed. She didn't yet understand the math, but she felt the pulse of the idea as if it were already alive. That night, she sat at a rickety desk in her room, the light from a single desk lamp pooling across her mother's sketches. Outside, the wind scraped branches against the window, the distant sound of horses shifting in their stalls carrying through the quiet. Her pencil moved quickly over the paper, rough outlines taking shape, her version of the design. But it wasn't just about proving the boys wrong anymore. It was about taking the fragment of her mother's vision and making it real, about giving life to something the world had never seen. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat a vow. She would finish what her mother started. Downstairs, her father's boots thudded across the wooden floor as he locked up for the night. The house creaked with the cold. She could hear the faint hiss of the kettle on the stove, the small, familiar rituals that kept them anchored. For the first time in a long while, the weight on her shoulders felt less like a burden and more like momentum. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the lines on the page until they blurred. Somewhere beyond the walls of that little room, Troy and his friends were certain she'd give up. Mr. Hawkins likely expected a half-finished project, another box checked in the ledger of inevitable failures.
But they didn't know what she had now.
The lamplight caught the faint indentation of her mother's handwriting pressed into the page beneath the sketch. It read, "Never stop building." Lila traced the words slowly, committing them to memory. Then she bent over the paper again, the shadows deepening around her, the sound of the pencil whispering over the page like a secret only she was meant to hear. When she finally set the pencil down, the first outline of her own design stared back at her, a blueprint not just for an engine, but for the fight ahead. The weeks that followed bled together in a blur of late nights and sore hands. By day, Lila endured the slow grind of school, the undercurrent of snickers from Troy and his friends never far from earshot. By night, she returned to the barn, its wooden beams groaning in the wind, where the smell of hay and rusted steel seemed to sharpen her focus. The desk lamp's glow painted her sketches gold, the lines growing more confident with each pass of the pencil. She started small, cleaning and repairing tools salvaged from her father's shed, reassembling discarded parts from farm equipment. The first time she coaxed life from a seized tractor carburetor, it sputtered stubbornly before catching with a steady hum. She smiled to herself, the sound warming something deep inside. When she presented the repaired part to Mr. Hawkins, he paused, his eyes narrowing in a flicker of surprise before he turned away with a noncommittal grunt. That flicker was enough to push her harder. She pored over her mother's notes until the pages felt like an extension of her own mind, learning to read the strange geometry of muscle-inspired mechanics. The drawings began to make sense, how a horse's leg absorbed impact and stored energy, how the sequence of muscle contractions could be mirrored in piston timing. She wasn't just copying anymore. She was creating. The turning point came the day she met Evelyn Carter. Lila had been sent to deliver a packet of invoices to the neighboring farm, where Evelyn lived alone with her aging mare, Starling. The woman had a reputation, part engineer, part horse whisperer, and entirely intimidating. Her gray hair was tied back in a no-nonsense braid, her sharp eyes seeming to measure everything they touched. "You're Lila Morgan," Evelyn said before Lila could introduce herself. "I knew your mother." The words made Lila's throat tighten. She followed Evelyn into a cluttered workshop that smelled faintly of oil and cedar. Blueprints were pinned to the walls beside photographs of thoroughbreds in mid-stride. Evelyn gestured toward a set of open plans spread across a table, mechanical designs interlaced with anatomical sketches of horse limbs. "Your mother's work," she said simply. "I helped her once years ago." Lila felt as if she'd stumbled into a hidden chapter of her own history. When Evelyn asked to see her drawings, Lila hesitated, then laid them out across the table. Evelyn studied them in silence, her brow furrowing, her lips twitching with something that might have been approval. "You're missing half the picture," Evelyn finally said. "But you've got the right instincts. I'll help you if you help me." The deal was simple. In exchange for mentorship, Lila would train Starling, who hadn't been ridden in months and had developed a habit of refusing jumps. It was an odd bargain, but Lila agreed without hesitation. Training Starling was more difficult than she'd expected. The mare's stubborn streak was as fierce as Lila's own, each failed jump a test of patience. But slowly, she learned the rhythm of the horse's stride, the subtle shift of muscle before takeoff, the balance between tension and release. These observations bled into her engine designs, the rise and fall of pistons echoing the flex and drive of Starling's legs. Evelyn proved to be a relentless teacher. She quizzed Lila on thermodynamics while they mucked stalls, challenged her to calculate torque ratios over dinner, and insisted that every new sketch be backed by practical testing. When Lila's first prototype jammed and spat smoke, Evelyn only raised an eyebrow. "Good. Now you know one way it won't work. Try again." The boys at school noticed the changes. Lila no longer flinched at their jibes. Her answers in class grew sharper, her hands surer on the tools. Even Mr. Hawkins began to ask her opinion on certain adjustments, though he never quite let his skepticism drop. One afternoon, during a scheduled shop demonstration, Lila unveiled her latest model. It was a small, sleek engine mounted on a wooden base, its components aligned in a way that looked almost organic. When she turned it on, the machine ran with a steady, rhythmic hum, quiet, efficient, strangely alive. The room fell silent. Even Troy's smirk faltered. Mr. Hawkins leaned over, inspecting the motion of the pistons. "Interesting," he murmured, as if the word had slipped out without permission. Lila felt the victory settle in her bones, but she didn't let it show. She simply packed up the model and returned to her seat, her mind already spinning with improvements. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she found Evelyn waiting in the barn. The older woman handed her an envelope with no return address. Inside was a letter embossed with the seal of the National Young Inventors Competition. "We submitted your work," Evelyn said, her voice even. "Now it's time to see how far you can really go." Lila's breath caught. The competition was in the city, a world away from the dusty field she knew. It wasn't just a chance to prove herself to her classmates. It was a chance to prove herself to the world. She looked down at her grease-stained hands, then back at the envelope. For the first time, the path ahead didn't feel impossible. It felt inevitable. The weeks leading up to the competition became a blur of metal, sweat, and sleepless nights. The barn had transformed into something between a workshop and a war room, its beams lined with tools, wires, and half-assembled components. The rhythmic sound of a file against steel blended with the quiet snorts of the horses in their stalls. Outside, frost laced the fields in silver each morning, but inside, the air was warm with the scent of oil and the faint sweetness of hay. Lila worked until her fingers ached, coaxing precision from stubborn parts and replacing any piece that dared defy her vision. Starling often stood nearby, her dark eyes following each movement, the steady rhythm of her breathing matching the cadence of the tools. Evelyn visited daily now, her sharp gaze scanning every weld, every alignment. She rarely praised, but when she did, the words were like solid ground beneath Lila's feet. At school, whispers trailed her. Someone had leaked a video of her prototype during a late-night trial. Its quiet, almost organic hum was unlike anything the boys had ever seen. The clip had spread online, drawing curiosity and, from some corners, resentment. Troy's smirk had sharpened into something colder, his jokes now edged with a quiet malice. One Friday afternoon, during the school's open day, each student was asked to display their project. Lila arrived early, carefully arranging her model on the workbench. The hum of voices filled the room as parents, teachers, and students milled about. For a moment, pride warmed her. Then Troy leaned in, his voice low and mocking. "Hope that thing runs as well under pressure as it does in your barn." She ignored him, focusing on her demonstration. The first few minutes went smoothly, the pistons moving in perfect rhythm, the hum drawing a small crowd. Then, with no warning, the machine sputtered, coughed, and spat out a stream of acrid smoke. Gasps rose from the audience. Mr. Hawkins stepped forward, concern tightening his features, but the damage was done. Troy's laughter rang in her ears like a hammer striking steel. Back in the barn that night, she dismantled the engine piece by piece, searching for the fault. A deep scratch across a key bearing told her everything: sabotage. Her hands trembled, anger and humiliation roiling in her chest. Evelyn found her hunched over the workbench, jaw tight. "Whoever did it doesn't matter," Evelyn said. "What matters is whether you let them finish the job." The words stung, but they anchored her. She replaced the damaged part and worked until dawn, the cold air turning her breath to mist. By morning, the engine purred again, smoother than before. Yet something else gnawed at her. In her mother's old notebook, a page she hadn't noticed before had come loose from the binding. On it, in careful handwriting, were the words, "Never for public release. Unstable under prolonged strain." Beneath the warning was a sketch nearly identical to her own design. Her chest tightened. What if her engine failed in front of the judges? What if her mother had abandoned the idea for a reason far more dangerous than difficulty? For 2 days, she avoided the barn, the weight of doubt pressing her down. She skipped a visit to Evelyn and even let Starling go untrained, her father taking over the chores. But one evening, she found him in the kitchen, standing over a pot of coffee, his expression distant. "Your mother faced the same voices you do now," he said without looking up. "People told her it couldn't be done. Some laughed. Some tried to make her quit. She never did. Her only regret was not finishing before she couldn't." He finally met her eyes. "If you stop now, you'll carry that regret too." The next morning, she was back in the barn. Evelyn didn't comment on her absence, simply handed her a stack of fresh steel plates and a look that said you know what to do. Lila tested the design under increasingly harsh conditions, pushing the pistons beyond what seemed reasonable. The flaw her mother had warned about did emerge, a loss of rhythm after extended operation, but instead of crumbling, Lila dissected it, studying every motion until she found the weakness. Inspiration came not in the workshop but in the pasture. She was watching Starling one afternoon when the mare stumbled slightly on uneven ground, then recovered seamlessly. The shift in stride was subtle but effective, a momentary change in motion that redistributed the load. Lila's breath caught. If she could replicate that adaptive adjustment in her pistons, the flaw would vanish. She worked through the night, designing a responsive gear mechanism that could alter its timing based on resistance. The final version was elegant in its simplicity, yet powerful. When she tested it the next day, the engine ran flawlessly, even under strain. Evelyn allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Now it's ready. The following week was a frenzy of preparation. Between finalizing her design and keeping up with school, Lila barely slept. The barn became her sanctuary and her proving ground. She and Starling trained together in the evenings, the horses' leaps growing higher and cleaner, the connection between rider and animal deepening. But the unease never fully left her. On the night before she was due to leave for the city, she packed the engine into a padded crate and secured it in the back of her father's truck. Outside, the wind howled, and the clouds hung heavy with the promise of rain. She lingered in the doorway of the barn, the lamplight spilling onto the wet ground. A flash of movement caught her eye. Across the yard, half hidden in the shadows near the fence, stood Troy. He didn't move, just watched her with a slow, deliberate smile before melting back into the darkness. She closed the barn doors and locked them, but the unease clung to her all the way back to the house. Upstairs, she lay awake listening to the storm gather strength, each gust rattling the windows like a warning. Somewhere deep inside, she knew the real test had yet to come, not just of her invention, but of everything she had built inside herself to get this far. The city seemed impossibly large, its glass towers piercing the winter sky like shards of light. Lila sat in the passenger seat of her father's truck, the crate containing her engines strapped down in the bed. The competition was being held in a sprawling convention center, its entrance lined with banners that fluttered in the icy wind. National Young Inventors Competition, celebrating the future of innovation. Her father parked, giving her a small nod that carried more weight than any speech. Inside, the vast hall hummed with energy. Rows of tables stretched out like runways, each occupied by young inventors hunched over machines, models, and displays. Judges in crisp suits moved between stations, clipboards in hand, their expressions unreadable. Cameramen threaded through the aisles, the soft whir of their equipment blending with the murmur of voices. Lila set her crate down on her assigned table, her breath shallow. She unpacked the engine with care, wiping a thin film of condensation from its polished frame. Evelyn's voice echoed in her mind. Set your hands first, then your heart will follow. She focused on her preparations, checking the gear alignment, securing the fuel intake, adjusting the timing rods. It was a rhythm now as natural as tightening a saddle. The room around her faded until it was just her, the machine, and the quiet certainty that she had done everything she could. Then she reached for the small toolkit she had packed that morning. Her hand stilled. One compartment was empty, the one that held the customized regulator pin essential to stabilizing the adaptive gear system. She rifled through the case, her pulse hammering.
Gone.
A flicker of memory. Troy standing in the shadows the night before. Her throat tightened. Without the pin, the engine would function for minutes before losing synchronization and failing. She sat back, the noise of the hall rushing in again like a tide. Her father noticed her frozen posture and stepped closer, concern etched into his weathered face. "What is it?" he asked. She shook her head, unwilling to say it out loud. A light touch on her shoulder made her turn. Evelyn stood there, holding a small cloth pouch. "Thought you might need this," she said, her voice steady. Inside were 2 regulator pins, machined to exact specifications. Always carry spares. That's lesson 3. The knot in Lila's chest loosened, gratitude rising so quickly it nearly undid her. Her turn came. A microphone crackled as her name was announced, and she stepped up to the demonstration platform. The audience was larger than she expected. Rows of judges in front, spectators and competitors beyond, cameras aimed from every angle. She cleared her throat, her voice steadying as she began. She spoke not of horsepower or torque ratios alone, but of rhythm. How efficiency could be found in the grace of motion, how a horse's stride could teach a machine to adapt, conserve, and endure. She described her mother's vision without naming the personal loss, letting the beauty of the idea speak for itself. When she turned the key, the engine came to life with that familiar, almost living hum. The pistons moved in a fluid cycle, the adaptive gear adjusting imperceptibly under varying loads. The room grew still, the sound drawing people closer. One of the judges leaned forward, his pen pausing mid-note. They tested it under pressure, heavier loads, extended operation, simulated environmental changes. Each time, the engine adjusted, maintaining its efficiency, never faltering. The rhythm was mesmerizing, like the gallop of a horse over open ground. When the final test concluded, the machine was still running as smoothly as when it began. The applause started small, then grew, filling the space. Lila stepped back, the heat in her cheeks both from relief and the quiet pride that came from seeing something you built stand on its own. Hours later, when the winners were announced, her name came first. She accepted the trophy with hands that no longer shook, the gold catching the light as flashes from cameras lit the stage. The scholarship offer was immediate. News outlets began circling, hungry for interviews. Somewhere in the crowd, Troy stood silent, his expression unreadable, but he didn't look away. Months passed. Her design moved from prototype to industry application, revolutionizing fields far beyond automotive mechanics. She was invited to speak at conferences, her words translated into languages she'd never heard before. Then, one spring morning, the letter arrived, formal, understated, almost unreal. The Nobel Committee is pleased to inform you she was the youngest recipient in history for physics, her contribution recognized as a leap forward in sustainable engineering. Yet when the cameras and speeches faded, Lila found herself back where it all began. The ranch, the barn, the hum of quiet work. Starling grazed in the pasture, her mane catching the evening light. Evelyn leaned on the fence, her father beside her, the two of them watching as Lila mounted the mare. The engine, now a full-scale model, sat on a workbench inside the barn, purring softly, its sound blending with the rustle of wind through the grass. She rode across the open field, the rhythm of Starling's stride and the steady hum of the engine in perfect harmony. The air was cool, the sky painted in bands of gold and violet. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the rush of motion, the pulse of life under her, the echo of her mother's words etched into her memory. Never stop building. At the crest of the hill, she reined Starling to a halt and looked back. The ranch, the barn, the people who had stood by her, it was all there, solid and certain. She whispered into the wind, "We did it, Mom." The breeze carried the words away, scattering them into the fading light. Somewhere, it felt like an answer came back. And as the last sunlight slid over the horizon, the girl who was never supposed to last a week in auto class rode on, carrying with her the rhythm that had changed everything.